Hello and welcome to the History Show on Near FM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and if you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the programme, go to nearpodcast.org/pcast/. As always, I am joined by my co-presenter John Dorney. This week we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Conor McCabe from the UCD School of Social Justice. Dr. McCabe is the author of Sins of the Father and regularly writes for the Irish Left Review website. Conor, you're very welcome to the programme.
Hi Carl, how are you?
One of the things we'd like to talk about is Ireland since the famine. It's always been said it was richer but it had fewer people. Why do you think that is?
It's one of the slow developments of the Irish economy over that period. Was that in the post kind of famine period, I mean, things like do kind of speed up. There was always a kind of tension in the rural economy between farmers who wanted to do tillage because there was more money in it for them, and the ranchers who wanted small farmers to raise small cattle for them. And there's a lot of kind of tensions and kind of clashes, in the 19th century then over this. But in the post-famine kind of period, things do kind of speed up because, I mean, there's over 1 million people, dead and who have left then the country. So there's a lot more land to use for kind of grazing, so that shifts the balance of power really, in like rural Ireland, in the south anyway, in what becomes then the south.
Conor, hi first of all.
Hi John. How are you?
You've argued about the post-famine society and the role of elites, kind of entrenched elites, Irish elites now, that included ranchers, cattle grazers and bankers and construction. Can you talk a little bit about how those groups came to be formed? Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't use... personally, I wouldn't use the phrase elite. I would say class. I would base that on it is a line by the American historian Howard Zinn, and he says that a historical analysis that's based on class, or that it takes class on board, is a lot more honest than one that just pretends that class doesn't exist. And I think he's right. And what we're seeing especially in the post-famine period, is the kind of consolidation of what becomes the kind of Catholic middle class, and that's the shift from the more kind of from the Protestant landowning class more onto the middlemen, onto those who were the who were the intermediaries in between foreign capital and the resources of the state, and they win the Civil War. Basically, they get to carve this state of ours in their own image for themselves, and that starts. I mean, again, around by 1870, a lot of the kind of social class formations in Ireland have been formed. Then, like by then, in the land war. I mean, by the 1890s, there's the ranch wars. You know what I mean? Then into the 1900s, then as well. That kind of inter-Irish kind of, for want of a better phrase, that starts to really kind of take on a lot of energy,
I think it's very interesting when you look the way Irish history is taught. They speak of the rural community as almost one homogenous group.
Yes.
There's no discussion of different classes, and when they do talk about conflict, it's very wealthy Anglo-Irish landlords and everybody else, or absentee landlords over in England. There's no discussion, as you say, about the ranch wars or land occupations.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when something like absentee kind of landlords is brought up, what's never brought up is who the hell is managing their lands for them. Mm-hmm. If they're absentee, somebody's doing it for them, and that's never brought up. Now who is that? Well, that's the indigenous Irish kind of middle class who are whose role is to administer the kind of landlord's kind of needs forever. It's a strange mix in that in kind of academic history in the 19th century, it's quite rich in social and economic class studies, but that doesn't happen in 20th century Irish historiography. It's almost like class ends in 1922. There's no class in the 20th century. There's the poor are not a class.
Conor, you've argued that in particular the grazers, the people who exported live cattle, they made money, but they were also in some ways a block on economic development in Ireland. Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, after 1922, a kind of partition of the island, I I would argue that Ireland. There's an argument out there about that's based loosely on this kind of theory of underdevelopment, and that Ireland was an undeveloped economy. I don't hold with that in any way whatsoever. Ireland was part and was fully integrated into one of the most advanced economic countries in the world at that time. Its role in that economy wasn't very sexy, but it was part of it, and it was completely part of a capitalist-based agrarian system of kind of production. So in that role, in that part, wherever the grazers had their role, which even in terms of the whole system, they're still being exploited. But in an Irish kind of context, they're making so much money in Ireland that they are kind of king players here. Now, there are three things that are exported. Again, this is mainly in the south, in what becomes the Free State, really. And we go into why that happened, why they have kind of so much sway. But Ireland is exporting live cattle, it's exporting credit, and it's exporting people. These are the three main exports of Ireland at this time. The Irish currency and banking system never breaks with sterling, and Ireland doesn't break with sterling formally until 1979. It doesn't have its own kind of central bank until 1943, and the very first act of that central bank was to say that we don't really need one. So what we have is a partitioned Ireland where there is formal political independence, but it's hardly a blip in terms of the economic links with the UK economy, and it is highly advanced. Saying that Ireland is like underdeveloped, it's a bit like saying that Devon is some kind of pre-capitalist nirvana because they have cattle in Devon. No one says that.
What's interesting to me is, I was researching last year the Irish Republican Brotherhood and their newspaper, Irish Freedom. And one quote in the newspaper, which I recall, is that they complained that they actually say much of what you've been saying, actually. But they said our island could be an island of a garden of 10 million people, and they have made of it a cattle ranch, the British. Now, what's interesting is that it's quite similar to what you're saying, but also that the people who were writing this were some of the first people to administer the Irish Free State, including Ernest Blythe, who also wrote The Future in Ireland Would Be Socialist, believe it or not, in 1912. So, what happened? Why didn't Ireland become a garden of 10 million people?
Well, again, it goes back to the nature of like partition and the nature of kind of modern of the modern kind of capitalist mode or production. And this sounds a bit kind of dogmatic, but there's not just an inter-class kind of conflict. This is what is usually seen, that there's the working class and then there's the kind of bourgeoisie, and this is a view that's put forward in the Communist kind of manifesto, and it's the one that is taken on board, and everyone ignores the 3 volumes of like Capital, where a more nuanced view of the kind of class relations is played out. But there's also an intra-class conflict as well, that you have merchant capital, industrial capital, and then finance capital. Now, with kind of partition, the industrial capital is more or less sectioned off from the southern merchants, finance capital then as well. So they get to set economic policy on their own terms. So that kind of balance of power doesn't really kind of play out then in Ireland. That there's no one really to oppose the banks in terms of changing economic policy. If you look at the in the States in the 1930s, one of the industries that's bankrolling like Roosevelt to take on Wall Street is like U.S. Steel, because they're trying to put finance back in its place. We don't have that with the North gone, so that intra-class conflict isn't taking place anymore. So with that, they get to set economic policy on their own terms, and with kind of finance, and then with the export model in Ireland of exporting what is essentially kind of a raw material over to the UK, that isn't broken at all. Now, there are some moves in the 1930s to try and kind of take that on. Like Fianna Fáil run on an anti-rancher campaign, but I mean, it was all things to all men kind of campaign, as the Fianna Fáil tended then to do. And they do make some gains in it, but they do kind of two things which I'm still trying to work out why they did it. Dev goes for building up indigenous industry, but it's for non-export, which is insane. I mean, he puts in all these tariffs to feed a market of 2.5 million people, most of whom are rural and have no real kind of spending money. So I mean, that runs out of steam of its own terms. So, but there was moves then like to take it on, but it doesn't go kind of far enough. As far as kind of taking it on, like that kind of some moves, and that argument that is that's made that Ireland was a closed economy. Again, it's nuts, absolutely nuts. Ireland is a very open economy, and even in the early kind of 1950s, Ireland's imports and exports as a percentage of overall kind of GDP, it's around 70%. That is not a closed economy; it's a very open one. The problem, and the structural problem, is that all that trade is basically with one country only, and that's the structural kind of problem. It is very open, but it's open with one country only, and that's what is Ireland has to change in the 1950s with. Because of its currency kind of policy, Ireland is buying dollars with sterling because it's linked then to like sterling, and with the whole kind of Marshall Plan, Ireland has to find a new way of getting dollars, which means more exports.
Conor, I think we might come back to the specifics of cattle exports as the show goes on, but one of the things that I think you've researched a lot and spoken about a lot is when the Free State is created, when the provisional government comes into power. And as John said, you had all these people who, when they were in the separatist movement, they're talking about the Ireland they'd like to create, they're talking about economic policies. How quickly do they abandon those ideals and sort of like almost hand over completely economic policy and currency policy to private banks?
Well, I would question how much of a conflict like there was. I mean, if you read like Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin during like 1913 and like 1912 and so forth, and 1911 and the Wexford kind of strikes. I mean, it's very clear where Griffith stands on like all of this. You know, I mean, he has this protectionist view, but he has no a real sense of taking on those kind of ingrained economic like systems. You know. As far as cattle goes, I really do think that we should make a 12-hour epic documentary purely on the dual-purpose shorthorn, because I think that the story and the full story of the dual-purpose shorthorn cow is just a great kind of sounding board for really exploring that whole area of cattle and the cattle industry. I mean, cattle exports to the UK rise from 1922 up to 1950s. Ireland becomes more dependent on its cattle exports to the UK after partition, because those vested interests are doing more and more then for it. I mean, in the 1920s, Ireland was talking about a form of trickle-down economics, that if you give all the tax breaks and all the incentives to the ranchers, they'll spend more money and hire people as cleaners, and then that'll be a good thing for kind of everyone else. God, that doesn't happen at all. Yeah. You know, people then export. You know. But
this seems to put a huge amount of pressure on the small farmers, particularly in the West, who take on all the risk in this economic relationship.
Absolutely, and it's structured kind of that way. I mean, small farmers have to sell their cattle after a year or so because they don't have the farms big enough to fatten them more than a year. Now, again, it's very interesting in terms of the Land Commission in the 1930s. There was a study done, I think, by either agriculture or finance into what was an economic farm size. And of course, 50 acres in the West is not the same as 50 acres in Meath. But it came up, I think, with a figure of around 34 acres. Now, this is in the 1930s. I mean, and like today, it's anything less than I think 70, and you're working part time, kind of somewhere else. But the land that was being given out under the Land Commission, I think those farms were being kept at 27 acres, 26 acres. So it was structured into the size of them to not, like, they were making uneconomic farms. This was their policy, to keep that system of production. It is an assembly line. It starts in the Connemara and it ends in the slaughterhouses of like Deptford outside London, and there's a whole assembly line all the way through. And that system, that the class nature of this, is ingrained in the very economic structures of the farm size and the type of the cattle that is being used. So it's like any attempt even to change that is fiercely kind of challenged. So much so that by the 1950s, Ireland has one of the highest kind of birth rates in Europe and is growing old. It's a country that the average age is actually growing old because of the huge immigration that is coming from it.
And it begs the question, why were the cattle being exported live? Why wasn't there development of industries for slaughtering cattle, for preparing the meat, for producing leather? Why didn't that happen? Well,
there were two main reasons. One was that the ranchers made money by exporting anyway, and then they have all their contacts in the UK, and that system had been going for 80 or 100 years. And then the other reason was that Ireland's currency was tied with sterling, so credit was extremely expensive based on the Irish economy. We had an overvalued currency. Our currency was linked with the currency of the empire and the largest empire of the world. What were we kind of producing to justify that level, at that wealth of that currency? Ireland needed kind of cheap credit. It needed to decouple that one-to-one link and have. It wasn't with like India or with Australia or even with Argentina, where it was linked to sterling and there would be kind of some kind of flexibility. Ireland had one Irish pound equaled one English pound. This was killing us, absolutely killing us, quite literally. And in the 1930s, in the second kind of bank commission, there's 2 volumes of like evidence, and page after page after page of people just saying, why are we linked with sterling? We cannot get credit because if we borrow money at what is essentially a UK prices, there's no way we can generate enough economic activity in the Irish economy to pay back that loan plus interest. So as far as trying to expand farms, even it was really, really difficult because credit was just so expensive. Ireland is a net exporter of credit in the 1920s. This is insane.
And this all sounds very abstract, of course, but what this means is that there isn't enough jobs to keep people alive, and people have to leave. And this is so all the dreams of a garden of 10 million people don't come to pass because of this.
It is no growth, happening. Even in terms of like housing. Because Ireland didn't make its own credit, it bought credit in the UK and then it sold it at like 1% higher than it bought in the UK. If you look at the Bank of England's interest rate level in Ireland, the banks would buy credit in the UK at like 2.5% and then sell it in Ireland at like 1% higher at like 3.5% each and every time. It's all the way through it. And what that means then, that there isn't any real kind of growth in the Irish economy. It cannot structure. Ireland is a regional economy and it's a nation state. It needed to change the structure of its economy, and there was no sense of actually kind of doing that whatsoever because the banks and the ranchers just did not want it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, Conor, one of the things that you mentioned in your book, Sins to Father, that seems absolutely unbelievable, but so much is in the book, is that we're buying sterling notes rather than sterling bonds, as one of the people who've looked into the Irish economy, one of the consultancy firms is talking about.
Yeah. This is from like Paul Rouse's book, his fantastic book, Ireland's Own Soil. It's a great sign, as an historian, when you read someone else's book and you're insanely jealous. And that was with kind of Paul Rouse's book. It is a minor classic. Absolutely, it's a brilliant book. But he talks about it. He in terms of the Irish economy and a lot of what I'm talking about, Paul would have very different. He would draw different kind of conclusions than I would. But the research is just absolutely amazing, and like it was from him that I pulled up this thing about IPEC, and it was an American consultancy firm who were brought in to try and, because Ireland has to restructure its economy in the 1950s. It needs to get foreign currency, and it can't use sterling anymore, because sterling has bought so many dollars as part of the Marshall Plan. Ireland's told you cannot use sterling anymore to buy, or to buy dollars. So there's a dollar crisis in Ireland, and this really kind of like drives out the need for expansion and the need to get foreign currency into the country, But I mean, they're brought in, and they look at Ireland's kind of a credit policy, and their jaws are just dropping here. It says, why are you buying notes? It said, if you bought the bonds even, you'd get a higher interest rate payment. But that whole idea of like fluency and all that, I mean, it just goes to show the last people who should ever be in charge of money are banks and bankers. They're just the last people, because they don't understand the nature of credit itself. They think money comes from money,
We must, beg the question, why did successive Irish governments abdicate currency policy and credit policy to private banks?
But this is a class thing, you see. You're dealing with this emerging kind of class that, how does class reproduce itself? How does it do it?
Well, I presume pulling the ladder up after themselves.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is, but how does something keep on happening intergenerationally? How does that happen? How does that occur? How a class reproduces itself is through the very structures of the state itself. That's the job of the state, is to reproduce class structures, and it does it through the nature of the economy, and through education, and through the kind of social strata itself. And that's what you see in the 1920s. And by 1932, pretty much that class has embedded itself in the very nature of the class, of the state itself. It routes itself completely through the very nature of the state itself. And that's one of the hardest things then, is that class, it's not six people sitting in like Monty Bourne's castle, drinking blood and going, whoa, that whatever, I mean, that's not what it is. People, they do the things because it's common sense, and that's just the way things go. But the common sense comes from like the way that the whole thing has been structured.
There's a kind of implication in the criticism of the early Irish state that if the credit wasn't there from Irish sources, the state should have led development, and they should have been Irish. They should have developed Irish industries in a state-based manner. Is that what you're arguing?
No, and not at all. I mean, it was an argument for us that if you've got a regional economy and you declare independence, you should restructure your economy as a national economy, and that's not what Ireland does. And the very first thing every kind of nation state needs is its own currency. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is insane to have a nation state emerge as a regional economy and not restructure it. Mm-hmm. And Scotland is facing these problems now. I mean, Scotland is having a referendum in like 2 years' time now. It's been confirmed, and they're talking about keeping the link with the Bank of England and sterling. Why bother becoming independent? Why bother? They might as well just stay with the UK. So I mean, Ireland gets to have its own, or the Irish kind of middle class get their own kind of nation state, and they get like to keep all the benefits from a regional economy as well. Like as I said, this idea that Ireland is underdeveloped I think it has obscured historians from the view that Ireland is deeply ingrained within the UK economy, and still is. Mm-hmm. Especially with the IFSC and the city of like London's probably for another day. Those links were not broken or changed in any way. And it's one thing, like if you're, as an example as to why it's important to change your regional kind of, from a regional economy to a national one. I mean, what that actually means is that in the 1920 local elections, both Sinn Féin and Labour and the Unionist parties as well all campaigned on how they were going to spend the housing grant money that had been passed, I think in the 1919 Act, Housing Act, Homes for Heroes. This idea of it. And you have all this thing about how they will spend all this Westminster money to build housing in the various kind of city and urban and local areas. That's the kickback. If you're part of an economy and your role in it is to provide the raw material, the quid pro quo there is that you get compensated for that via tax transfers. Right? In 1922, Ireland loses all those tax transfers, but keeps that regional economy there going. This is a win-win situation for the UK. It's getting all the raw material and doesn't have to pay for it via tax transfers anymore. And slowly over the years, Ireland starts to decay because it's not getting, it's structured in that way. Our job is to provide all this kind of all this cattle, but the quid pro quo is, you fund the national school system, or you fund kind of housing, and then post 1945 there's the health system then as well. You need to have or change your regional economy, and the one that can generate enough of a tax base to pay for the benefits of having a nation state, and Ireland doesn't do that whatsoever.
We're just going to have to take a very quick break, and we'll be back with Dr. Conor McCabe shortly. And we're back. You're listening to the History Show on Near FM. We're here with Dr. Conor McCabe. Conor, how did things change when Fianna Fáil were elected in 1932? It's
an interesting, in terms of Irish governments in the South post 1922, it's the closest thing to a vision-based or kind of radical-based government. Not the first one, the one that lasted for about 8 months, the minority one. But after kind of Fianna Fáil stole all of Labour's policies, all the housing policies, and they kind of ran on them and won a majority then for the next kind of 16 years. And then slowly moves then to the right over those 16 years and becomes very kind of anti-union in the 1940s. But in that first kind of 3 or 4 years, there were kind of benefits done it. Fianna Fáil builds houses for the urban kind of working class, and the working class did not forget that. People even today in North Inner City and South Inner City still talk about Tony Gregory. That was just one housing scheme built. Picture what happens over 4 or 5 years of this in terms of Fianna Fáil. There were as many houses built, I think, from 1922 to 1932 as from 22 to 26, but the composition of those houses was quite different. Elecum Gael ran on grants and tax breaks for private house building, whereas Fianna Fáil hired labour and they built them themselves for renting for the urban kind of urban and rural kind of working class. And there are moves then to try and restructure the economy, but it is quite piecemeal. And again, it doesn't go after the two most important structural faults. One is the credit kind of situation, where credit is being exported over to the city of London, and then secondly, its reliance on exporting live cattle on the hoof over to the UK. They're not seriously challenged. I know that there's a thing about the economic war, but that was a kind of we live in a world of unintended consequences. This is what we live in, and Dev didn't quite expect them to put a ban on the live cattle exports, and that kind of messed them over then. So it was, but by 1936 they're back on message, very much so. You have even in terms of the restructuring of farm size, which has been a contentious issue since the Land Acts themselves back in the 1880s, when small farmers, instead of renting an uneconomic farm, were now the proud owners of an uneconomic farm. The whole kind of ranch wars in the early 20th century was trying to get farms to an economic size level and back to tillage as well, because there's more kind of pay in that for the farmer. But again, the big change, of course, is in the post kind of World War period, because Ireland has to now find other ways of gaining foreign currency to balance its trade deficits. And this puts enormous pressure down, because now Ireland has to tackle head on the banking system and the link with sterling, and the ranchers, or let Ireland die. Well, it finds this like third way. We'll import credit and we'll import businesses, and this is where you see this as the new way, as the golden new way now for Ireland. It doesn't start with kind of Whitaker. It starts back in 1949 with the first inter-party government, but they don't want to pay for it or expand in any way. So you have Alec Norton, who's part of the inter-party government, flying around, the world, to Germany, to out to the States. There's a very strange story about them sending Ben Briscoe's father. I don't know his first name.
Robert Briscoe.
Yeah. Robert Briscoe, to New York to try and get fundings. And in the newspaper they said, we sent the Jew over to New York because he's a Jew, so he'll get the money off the Jews in like New York. And you're reading this from the 1940s, and you're there going, you can't be writing this stuff. But that was the idea. We'll send Robert, the only Irish Jew, and we'll send him over, to try and get some money off them. So you can see part of the Enda Kenny thing on like Time magazine. There's the same type of view of we'll get that foreign money, But I mean that runs out of steam, and then by kind of 56, they bite the bullet and move to stop the crazy idea of balanced budgets, and that's the real change with kind of 57 and with kind of Sean Lemass and with Whitaker. They decide to actively run a budget kind of deficit,
Well, I think one of the interesting things for Irish, even Leaving Cert Irish history students, is that in any of the books you read, the newspapers, the history books, there's no, I won't even say criticism, but no even discussion of the role of T.K. Whitaker and Sean Lemass. Pre-59, everything was black and gloomy. Lemass takes over, the economy is transformed. Yeah. And there's no real discussion of like, well, what happened? Could it have been done differently? Is this the best we could have done?
Well, Ireland is Ireland's economy has just flatlined in the 1950s, and there's a take up in the UK in the 58. There's a bit of a boom which helps Ireland's exports, and Whitaker and Lemass just seize on that, saying, listen, this is ours then as well. But really, you've got Irish Times editorials in 62 and 63 going, where's the boom that we're talking about here? Because where are the jobs, there are, by 1970, I think there's a slight drop in the amount of jobs in the country than there were in 1959. But the composition of those jobs has changed kind of greatly. So in terms of net jobs growth, there isn't any in the 1960s. There isn't at all. It actually drops by a few thousand, but the composition changes. Ireland does change away from a mainly agrarian economy, and it does start to industrialise, but it's importing foreign industry. It's a type of industry that isn't allowed really in their own countries anymore. In the 1960s, there's growth in environmental laws in Canada and in the US, and Ireland has none. So this is one of the reasons why Ireland has such a large, in terms of export, not in terms of employment, a large pharmaceutical industry, because Ireland has, in the 1960s, has no environmental laws and a seemingly unlimited kind of supply of water, which is what you need to process kind of chemicals. So they're just flooding then. But they've been offered the shop in Ireland. Do what you want, and you have like huge kind of pollution in Cork in the 1960s, and then all those kind of issues then then as well. That if you bring, and like what's really not tackled is that if you bring foreign industry into your economy, it's not the primary industry where the jobs are, it's in the feeder industries, and Ireland does not do this really at all. There's no sense of linking it with the rest of the economy kind of whatsoever, and that's why it always tends to be on the surface, and then always. But in terms of the miracle, as it's called, I mean, it's really with the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement in 1965, which really is the real kind of boost in terms of foreign investment, as it's called, in Ireland, because it's a way into the UK economy for German and French and for US like companies. It's also the start of the Eurodollar market. So the First National Bank of New York opens up an office in Dawson Street, I think around 64 or like 65, purely as it's kind of Eurodollar kind of market branch as well. So that happens then as well,
Well, as you were talking there about the petrochemical industry and pollution, one of the, I'm going to say exasperating, but so much of your book is exasperating, is about how the Irish government deals with the exploitation of natural resources and the licences that are handed off to foreign companies.
Yeah.
In some cases, they see zero returns for it, and are left with the bill for cleaning it up afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, it was in an article in 1972 or 73 in the Irish Times where he said that the first oil and gas licenses sold, there was one license sold basically for the entire Irish block, and they put a figure on it that it was sold for £500. And then a 1/3 share of that was sold 2 or 3 years later, I think, for $350,000. And the company that had been kind of set up, that vanishes, So I mean, this being Ireland, you have to think that, were there a few pews booked in like Conway's pub during the 1960s as well,
We talked about one great orthodoxy of Irish history, Irish economic history, which is that Sean Lemass and T.K. Whitaker dragged Ireland unwillingly into the 20th century.
Nonsense.
The other one is that Ireland joined the EEC, and the grey clouds lifted and peaks of sunshine gathered in Ireland. Do you go along with that?
No, I mean, again, it's a small farmer who gets royally screwed in the EEC. In the 1960s, there was Irish banks suddenly start giving out credit, hand over fist, and there's a scheme to double the amount of calves in the country, and this has all been kind of justified on the back of Ireland joining the EEC and having these kind of new markets. Well, in 1972, when it does join, or 73, when Ireland like those join, that these markets don't kind of materialise. But the Irish government has negotiated or did negotiate a guaranteed price for the calves, for the cattle that is being kind of exported from the country. This was there would be a subsidy to guarantee that price, but not for the calves that have been sold in the internal kind of market. So small farmers now have this kind of glut of calves on their hands. They're not allowed to export them. There's a ban on calves exports, I think, under 1 year at this stage in Ireland. So the small farmer has all these calves. He can't fatten them because he doesn't have enough grass then to do it. Has to sell them at knockdown prices onto the ranchers, who have a guaranteed price for their exports that has been kind of worked out by Irish ministers in the EEC in like 1973. So they sell off all these calves at knockdown prices, but they're still labelled or like lumbled with the loans that they're taking out on these kind of products, and the banks start taking those farms. I mean, it is absolutely. I mean, it is a sin. What happens in those areas, and part of Ireland joining the EEC was the fishing rights. We just gave up all that real estate. Just went, and that was the quid pro quo. So all that real estate that went with the North Atlantic, Ireland just hands over and it hands them over for the calf for the cattle kind of subsidies.
Well, I remember listening to you giving the Raymond Crotty lecture before, and when you think back at the time about people like Raymond Crotty, even people like Anthony Coughlin and so on, there's almost an idea that anyone who criticises the EU or their economic policies are a crank.
Yeah.
There's no discussion of the points that they're making, and it seems to continue up to the present day.
Yeah. I mean, like, you know, it's one of those things. I mean, in terms of intellectual discourse in this country, I don't think we can underestimate the influence and role of the Troubles in all of this. It certainly has held back Irish historiography 40 years, because there's no discussion of the links, of the economic links post-partition with the UK, because that might fall Ireland into some kind of post-colonial kind of situation, and that's a bit provo, you know. So I mean, so it's amazing how any kind of discussions of Ireland and the EU and the EEC has been held back by the 30 years of the Troubles itself. So I mean, any kind of cogent analysis of what's going on is seen as either being provo or anti-provo, and that's had enormous damage in terms of even our understanding of ourselves.
I'm going to vulgarise your theory enormously, Conor, but
Go for it.
In the recent boom, so-called Celtic Tiger, you've argued that it's a combination of a lot of trends. You've this inviting in of foreign capital, which was started under Lemass.
Yeah.
You have ancillary industries in banking, in building, and in agriculture export, which, well, not so much agriculture export, but certainly in building, which sort of leech off or service foreign capital. And it all ends very badly. But you argue that it's a culmination of long-term structural problems. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Western economies, there has been a shift since the 1970s away from industry and towards financial services. Now, why this has happened is still being kind of talked about. There's no real consensus on why this has happened, but the fact that it has happened is well known, and that's kind of reflected in the type of investment that is coming into Ireland then as well. That by the 1980s, there are the kind of headline Dells and Gateway 2000 and the Gintels, but really, as the nature of Western kind of business has changed, so has the nature of the investment, so-called, in this country as well. And Ireland went with that trend and moved towards financial services. So I mean, what has stayed the same all the way through is that the class that tends to call the shots. This is not. It's not a template for every single business in Ireland, but those that really get to set economic policy at a national level are really those who act as middlemen in between foreign capital and the resources of the state. Now, in the 1930s and the 1940s, those resources were basically it was credit and it was live cattle. In the 1960s and the 1970s, it was access to the UK and the EEC kind of markets, and now its resource is Ireland's ability as a fully paid up member of the UN to formulate its own tax laws. So Ireland has become this kind of this form of a tax haven because it's able as a nation state to formulate tax laws that are recognised internationally, and that is quite a selling point if you want. So this is what is now being traded in Ireland. It's our ability to make tax laws for foreign capital, no questions asked whatsoever. Now, we saw that in the newspapers quite recently, there kind of last week, with the news of the IFSC clearinghouse group that had been basically wrote part of the budget for of the tax laws for itself. I'm sure all of us would love to be able to write our own kind of tax laws, but they actually have that power. Now, that is a tradable source. Now, those who kind of feed off that Well, these are the ones who are making all the noises. I mean, the largest single investor in Ireland at the moment, in terms of foreign direct investment, the greatest source of that at the moment into Ireland is Bermuda. Ireland is a net exporter of investment as well. And where does the investment go?
Bermuda?
It's Bermuda, you know. I mean, the money comes in and the money goes back out again. It comes in, it's washed of its tax obligations. It's given the stamp of approval by a fully functioning nation state, and then it's sent on its merry way. And that's what Ireland does now, you know. I mean, that's what is being traded, is that ability to make tax laws. And
certainly in terms of our current crisis, what I think, if I can again paraphrase, what you're arguing is that the problem is the investment doesn't stay in Ireland.
No.
It doesn't do anything in Ireland. It comes and goes.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's I think there's a turnover in derivative trading in the IFSC of 27 billion a day. Now, if you had goods and services being sold on Grafton Street that came to 27 billion, you would notice it in the local economy. You cannot have 27 billion a day, 5 days a week, 52 weeks of the year being traded and not notice it. But where is it? I mean, in terms of Dublin, if you look at the country as a whole, the percentage of the workforce that's engaged in finance and insurance is around 2 or 3% in each county, until you get to the East Coast. And you know, at its high point is Dunleary, Rathdown, where one job in every eight, one person in every eight of the workforce who lives in Dunleary and Rathdown is engaged in finance and insurance. So I mean, this is a Dublin thing. The IFSC is a good thing for Dublin, but you get past the M50 and it's where's the impact, you know?
I think one of the most disappointing things about the current crisis is the lack of debate. When you're talking about stuff going back to the early 20th century and all the subsequent decades, it seems inexplicable that, you know, even though there were individuals, that people couldn't see what was going on. That seems to be the same thing now, that we seem to be told, put your head down, things will improve eventually, but no real arguments about how to improve the economy, looking back at what we did wrong in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's, that's true enough, you know. But again, I mean, it's the nature of kind of opposition in this state. I mean, the main ideological template, the common sense that rules, you know, kind of mainstream thought in Ireland is a kind of it's a bastardized kind of version of corporatism and the Catholic social teaching. So I mean, this is the viewpoint that's held even by the trade union movement as well, you know. So I mean, and again, it goes back to that class is reproduced in the nature of the state itself. If you pick up kind of newspapers from the 1930s and the 1940s, you will see cases of children dying in industrial schools, being in some cases kicked to death, and this is in all the newspapers. But when you bring if you're someone who would bring that then to the guards, and the guards say we don't care, where do you go next? You know what I mean? That if you are constantly, it's one thing to be aware of it, and it's another thing when the state itself says, you know what, we don't care, we do not care, you know, and that has a kind of knock-on effect on an intergenerational way. It's that power in Ireland is never challenged, or when it is, it's blown out of the water, you know. I mean, that's the real kind of thing. That is, I mean, that's the most frustrating thing for people who want to change things, is that if you try to use the nature of the structures of the state itself, well, they're asking those structures to do themselves out of a job, and not surprisingly, they don't do that.
So you talked about sterling, the link to sterling, and how it prevented Ireland having an independent fiscal policy. You couldn't devalue for a long time.
Yeah.
And for a pretty brief window, we did have our own currency, and now we're linked again with another super currency, the euro.
Yeah.
Do you view that as another block on Irish development?
Well, I mean, it's more down to the nature of the euro itself. The euro is a bizarre currency. It is a bizarre one. It's in the euro, it is a central bank that with no nation state, and there's nation states with no central banks. That's never been really kind of tried before, and I think now we know why. Regardless of whether Ireland's future is in the euro or not, someone has to convince me that the euro has a future in those structures itself. Now, one of the things that is always kind of lost in terms of kind of economic policy is this idea that that markets, that economics drives things. This makes me kind of laugh a bit, because I mean, when markets mess up, the state steps in to kind of save it time and time and time again. So the euro will last for as long as there's a political structure in place to kind of keep it going, you know. If that starts to kind of fall apart, well, that's a different thing altogether. But in terms of Ireland being part of the euro, again, either you're a nation state or you're not. And the euro and joining the euro that isn't a nation state, even a federalist one, was a ridiculous thing to do. Absolutely kind of ridiculous. But I mean, in terms of business, if you look at the IFSC, it's been enormous business for finance in this country, and for accountants and for stockbrokers. It's been a really good time. There was around 48 specialist debt kind of securities listed on the Irish Stock Exchange in 1998. And a variation of these, it would be mortgage-backed kind of securities that I think people would be kind of familiar with. There was 48 of them in 1998. There was 25,000 of them in 2006. And nobody's listing these for love. Everyone that is being listed, someone's getting paid a fee. Someone's getting paid somewhere along the line. That is a hell of a lot of money in fees that's been generated. So I mean, there has been a boom, but it hasn't been in the wider Irish economy. It's been for those sectors that are covered by that. In these terms, now it's stockbroking, it's accountancy, and our politician friends. You know, so I mean, in terms of the future, in terms of what you're saying about, you know, having a future, the euro itself is a crazy currency. Now, I'll finish on this one, but Jean-Claude, it is Jean-Claude. I would say Jean-Luc. It's the Star Trek fan of me. I would say kind of Jean-Luc, but Jean-Claude Trichet gave the first annual TK Whitaker for being brilliant, wherever it is. You know, the TK Whitaker, I should get both parachutes talk. You know what I mean? In 2004, you know. And at it, he listed all the structural problems with the euro and said, this is what's wrong with it here. It's not a nation state. It doesn't have this. There's no real transference of surplus in the area. A problem faced by Ireland, of course, because that surplus from the UK is not being transferred to kind of compensate for Ireland for being part of the sterling. So all the money is gone over, but there's no kind of quid pro quo. It is pure credit extraction. So he lists them all and then says, but it's okay, because as long as we keep inflation under 2%, everything will be fine. Now, a year later, he was speaking in like Singapore, and the money market guys over there said, you've got an asset price bubble in the eurozone. It says, what are you going to do about it? He said, it's not our job to worry about inflation in asset prices, and asset prices includes houses now, of course. Our job as a central bank, and he paraphrased Alan Greenspan, who said a similar thing after the dot-com bubble burst in like 2001. He said, our job as a central bank is not to burst investment and innovation and all the other words, which, you know, all the we're great, we should get both parachutes words that these guys always say about themselves. It's our job to clean up the mess afterwards. Well, he got his wish. You know, he certainly did. Be always careful what you wish for, Mr. Trichet, because you got it.
Well, on that note, unfortunately we could go on an awful lot longer, but thank you very much to Dr. Conor McCabe.
Thanks a lot, lads.
Thanks very much to my co-presenter John Dorney. If you want to listen to this or previous episodes of the podcast, go to nearpodcast.org/pcast. My name is Cathal Brennan. Thank you very much for listening.